This is Chapter 7, which is on memory. So let's first look at the process of remembering and what is memory. Memory is our ability to take in, solidify, store, and then use information. The process of memory is that you first encode the information from the outside world, which means it just reaches your senses. You hear it, you taste it, you smell it, you touch it, and then your brain makes sense of that. Consolidation is when this memory solidifies. The memory is now resistant to distraction, interference, and decay. And then it is stored. And this is the stage in which our brains actually store the information that was encoded and consolidated, the retention of memory over time, so it sticks with you. Then retrieval is locating the information that has been stored and returning it to consciousness. So those are 4 stages of memory, the things we go through. Memory aids, pay attention. That's the very first advice I could give you, is simply to pay attention. Pay attention to what you see and hear and taste and touch. And then there are different levels of processing. You can see the diagram. I'm not going to go through the whole diagram, but you can definitely look at that more closely, and it'll show you different levels of processing and how we encode in those levels. Sleep is very important for memory aids. You know, that's one reason it's not good to, for example, cram for an exam right before the exam, because you're not going to get any sleep and you're not going to remember as well. But if you can start studying early, then even being able to sleep for a couple of days before the exam will help your memory. And also emotion. When we're in highly emotional situations, we often remember those. For example, if you have a baby, that's a very happy emotional situation, and so you're more likely to remember the details of that event because of the emotion. So what are some memory impediments? What keeps us from remembering very well? Well, distraction, also known as multitasking. Often we have to multitask in life. Often more than not, we have to multitask in life. But come to find out, it's not very effective. It doesn't really help us consolidate things into our memory because we're distracted from one thing by another. Emotion, again, we mentioned emotion. Remember, this was a memory aid. Having a baby, again, is a high emotional time, so we tend to remember every detail. Emotion can help us remember events, but the recall will not always be accurate. Sometimes emotions actually distort your memories. For example, eyewitness testimony. If an eyewitness witnessed a violent event, that's a very emotional event. So they're more likely to remember that event, but it also might have caused them so much stress that they don't remember things as well. So basically, emotion can be a memory aid, but it also can be a memory deterrent by keeping us from being able to focus as well on things during that event. So there are 3 stages of memory. Sensory memory, which is just brief, a few seconds, the impression we get when first recognizing a stimulus. Remember, the stimulus could be through any of the 5 senses. There's short-term memory, which means if you maintain focus on the object in your sensory memory, it will become part of your short-term memory. In other words, you still remember the stimulus for a few minutes after it goes away. Long-term memory, the textbook refers to it as the capacity to store a vast amount of information. Some other helpful terms from the textbook. The example of chunking, you can see the numbers. It's like a social security number. It's much easier to remember the second type of number with the dashes because you chunk the numbers together. So that's one way of helping you remember things. Rehearsal, simply repeating the same material and reviewing the same material over and over again can help you remember it. The serial position effect means that we may recall items better that are on a certain part of a list. This includes the primacy effect, which means we're more likely to remember the words at the beginning of a list. And then the recency effect, which is the opposite, we're more likely to remember the words at the end of a list. But the stuff in the middle kind of gets muddled. We don't remember that as well. Some more helpful terms: implicit memory. Think of riding a bike. We perform this activity automatically without consciously recalling every specific step. Our bodies just do it automatically. We don't have to think about it. However, explicit memory is memory for specific information. There are two types of explicit memories: episodic memory, memories of things that we've experienced or happened in our presence, also called autobiographical memory, so again, things that we've actually experienced and that were part of our life. And then there's semantic memory, which is simply just your knowledge. For example, most people know that Earth is a planet. So semantic memory is just your knowledge, the things you know. So memory and the brain. Neurons. When a neuron is stimulated, perhaps again through the senses, vision or hearing, or the other senses, it will fire, which connects it to other neurons. If this process is repeated and continued, these clusters form long-term bonds and are consolidated into a memory. So, excuse me, I included a chart here of the different brain regions and how they relate to memory. Again, I'm not going to go through the whole thing because that would take a while, but feel free to research that and see how each part of those brains relate to memory. So how reliable is our memory? Reconsolidation is the process of remembering changes our original memory, or the idea that the process of remembering changes our original memory. So sometimes we don't remember things as well as we think we do. Sometimes just the act of remembering may change the details of what we remember. Selective attention, we select what we pay attention to. If we tried to take in everything in our environment, sensory overload would occur. When you're remembering something, there's no way you took in everything in your environment. You probably focused on certain things. You selected certain things to pay attention to. Divided attention, trying to focus on more than one activity at once. Remember, we discussed multitasking earlier as a memory impediment. It just doesn't work. We're not able to remember as effectively. Some people have false memories, which are memories that never happened but were suggested by someone or something. Recovered memory, memories that have been blocked or repressed for a long period of time until a certain event brings them back to consciousness. An example of that you often hear about is people who have repressed childhood abuse. And then at some point it becomes a recovered memory. Suggestibility. Memories are implanted in our minds based on leading comments, questions, or suggestions by someone else or some other source. We're suggestible. We believe what other people say, and so that implants a memory. The misinformation effect. Incorrect information is learned after an event that gets incorporated into the memory as true. Similar to suggestibility. We hear incorrect information and somehow it becomes incorporated in our memory even though it's incorrect. So why do we forget things? We've talked about memory and the different stages and the impediments to memory, but so why do we forget? Interference theory, there's two types of interference. Retroactive interference, which means you gain new knowledge which interferes with your old knowledge. Proactive interference means that your old knowledge interferes with the ability to gain new knowledge. Repression, the idea that an experience was so traumatic that although it is stored in someone's memory, they are unable to bring it to a conscious level until it becomes a recovered memory, which we just discussed, the example of child abuse. That memory is often repressed. Amnesia, there are two types of amnesia, and these are usually due to some sort of physical trauma. Retrograde amnesia is a trauma prevents the person from remembering what happened prior to the trauma. They don't remember anything before it happened. Anterograde amnesia is when the person has memory trouble following a traumatic experience. So they remember everything before the trauma, but after the trauma, they have a lot of trouble with their memory. So those are some reasons that we often forget things. So that was just a little bit about memory and forgetting. I know some of the terms are a little bit difficult to understand, so I would encourage you to go to your textbook and research any terms that seem difficult and ask me anytime also. Feel free. I don't mind at all. Thank you.